Welcome everyone to the panel. We're going to give it a couple minutes. Folks are still streaming in, and then we'll get rolling. I'm Bill Hartung. I'll be the moderator today, and I'll tell you more about the participants and the kind of run of the event in a couple minutes. All right, thanks for coming. If you're here for the panel on corruption, arms trade, and security assistance, you're in the right place. And if you didn't intend to come here, stay anyway. So I'm Bill Hartung. I'm a senior research fellow at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. I'll be moderating today. I'll tell you a bit about our speakers in a moment. First, I want to thank the sponsors, the Arms Control Association, the Center on Civilians in Conflict, Democracy in the Arab World Now, the Security Assistance Monitor at the Center for International Policy, and the Stimson Center. And of course, the Forum on the Arms Trade and Jeff Abramson. This is a tremendous network, a great resource. I recommend going to their website for all manner of information about the arms trade. I use it regularly in my writing and refer reporters to it. And it's an organization well worth connecting with and supporting those of us who are able to do that, or find people who are able to do that. Keep in mind you can put questions in the Q&A as we go along, so please do that. The chat will be open, but don't put your questions there. That's just for running commentary, and as long as it's it doesn't get wild there, it will stay open. So there's plenty to talk about on the corruption issue. I think we'll look both at the extent of it, the consequences of it, what we might do about it. And we have an excellent panel, which I'll introduce everybody in a moment. But first, I want to introduce our opening speaker, Mira Resnick. Mira is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Regional Security in the Bureau of Political Military Affairs. In that role, she oversees the Bureau's Office of Regional Security and Arms Transfers. They manage government-to-government defense equipment transfers through various channels. Prior to working at State, she was a senior professional staff member, House Committee on Foreign Affairs, focused on the Middle East and North Africa. So there's much more that could be said, but I think, for the moment, I'll just say we're honored to have Mira with us today, and we'll turn to her remarks. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Bill. And let me first thank Jeff Abramson and the Forum on the Arms Trade Steering Committee for inviting me to engage with your network of civil society experts and exchange ideas on promoting a more responsible arms trade. In particular, how we can better address the risk that arms trade and security assistance will contribute to corruption. And thanks everyone for hosting me today. And good morning to all that are participating. As Bill kindly stated in his introduction, I am Mira Resnick, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Regional Security in the Bureau of Political Military Affairs. In this capacity, I oversee PM's Office of Regional Security and Arms Transfers and the management of our foreign military sales, our excess defense articles, and third-party transfers. And I also oversee PM's Office of Security Assistance and its security sector assistance programs. I'm especially looking forward to the panel today, hearing from panelists, really such experts in this field, Michael Picard and Jodi, Vittori, and of course, moderator Bill Hartung. Before I speak directly on the State Department's efforts related to arms transfers and security assistance, I want to focus on the larger perspective for a moment to highlight the Biden-Harris administration's broader approach to corruption. In its first year, the Biden-Harris administration formally made countering corruption a core U.S. national security interest and worked to rally our partners in the fight against corruption, including by hosting the Summit for Democracy last December. Many Democratic leaders took the opportunity there to announce new commitments to fight corruption at home and overseas, and we are now working with our partners to turn these words into concrete progress through the year of action. The administration also released the first ever U.S. strategy on countering corruption, which provides a comprehensive approach to how the United States will work domestically and internationally with government and non-governmental partners to prevent, limit, and respond to corruption and related crimes. Also in December, Secretary Blinken announced a new position of coordinator on global anti-corruption. The coordinator will integrate and elevate the fight against corruption across all aspects of U.S. diplomacy and foreign assistance, working closely with interagency and international partners, and will oversee implementation of the new strategy. The State Department and other agencies are now in the process of developing and implementing initiatives to support each of the strategy's 5 pillars, and I'll go into them just very briefly. The pillars are modernizing, coordinating, and resourcing U.S. government anti-corruption efforts, curbing illicit finance, holding corrupt actors accountable, strengthening multilateral anti-corruption efforts, and the last one, improving diplomatic engagement and leveraging foreign assistance to advance anti-corruption objectives. Now, each of these pillars can help address the more specific risks that arms sales and security assistance might contribute to corruption, but Pillar 5, improving our and leveraging our foreign assistance, that line of effort explicitly addresses the security sector, which I will return to in a moment. And since we're in the early stages of implementing the strategy, this session today is well-timed so that we can solicit ideas from civil society, from you, about how we can best achieve the strategy's objectives. And it's also well-timed because of how the Kremlin's war against Ukraine has brought renewed urgency to our collective efforts against corruption. President Putin's premeditated war of choice on Ukraine is an assault on key principles of the international system that have helped preserve peace and security among nations over the last 80 years. We can also say that Putin's war of choice against Ukraine was in part a reaction to our Ukrainian partners' efforts to combat corruption. Just before the invasion, Putin himself expressed concern with U.S. support to Ukraine's anti-corruption institutions. It is well documented how corruption has bolstered the Kremlin, which uses corrupt oligarchs and their affiliates to promote and carry out its dangerous and destabilizing agenda domestically and abroad. The U.S. government is working with allies and partners around the world to uncover corruption and promote accountability, not least in the context of the war against Ukraine. In addition to economic sanctions against key oligarchs, we have imposed visa restrictions on Russian oligarchs, their family members, and their close associates. We have also announced U.S. and international task forces to track down these oligarchs' assets. Our coordinated efforts with our allies and partners demonstrate the impact of collective action and put Russia's kleptocrats on notice. They cannot support a violent regime and operate with impunity. At the same time, we are perhaps seeing the corrosive effects of this systemic corruption in Russia's performance on the battlefield. While it's too early to draw conclusions, we have seen the same anecdotes in open source reporting: expired rations, lack of fuel, outdated and poorly maintained equipment that point to the waste, misuse, and abuse of public resources designated for Russia's military. This may be a case where the ill effects of the Kremlin's kleptocracy are degrading Russia's combat effectiveness. Nevertheless, we have to recognize that the lesson applies to U.S. security partners the same as it does to our competitors. Corruption in the security sector is not simply a moral issue or question of good governance. It is a matter of whether we can rely on a partner to employ the capabilities we have helped them develop and to perform in a professional manner. Pillar 5 of the Countering Corruption Strategy, which I mentioned earlier, tasks the U.S. government with integrating anti-corruption considerations into security cooperation and assistance. It calls on us to develop protocols for assessing corruption risks before initiating security sector assistance activities, including by assessing the nature and causes of corruption in the security sector and the political will of partner governments to undertake anti-corruption reforms. The strategy asks us to develop mitigation measures where substantial corruption risks are identified and to weigh the costs and benefits of proceeding with assistance in such cases. It also calls on us to include more deliberate considerations of security sector governance in assistance planning processes, educate our workforce on this, and consider how we might incorporate standards for security sector governance into the review of security assistance programs and arms transfer cases. Finally, the strategy calls for enhanced training to incorporate anti-corruption considerations into security cooperation and assistance, and to leverage security assistance to help establish internal accountability mechanisms within the security sector. These lines of effort make up only a small part of the overall strategy, less than a page in fact, but each one represents a significant level of effort when it's unpacked. In the Political Military Affairs Bureau, we are moving out on these initiatives in coordination with our Department of Defense colleagues, and indeed, our initiatives have begun to take shape. For example, the Biden-Harris administration has been working to update the conventional arms transfer policy, our CAT policy, to ensure that it reflects the president's goal of revitalizing U.S. leadership on democracy and human rights, among other priorities. As we review the policy, we seek to elevate human rights, stress the principles of responsible use, and security sector governance as part of our holistic approach. Part of evaluating our partners' security sector governance in arms transfer decisions is assessing the level of security sector corruption and the risk that arms would be diverted or otherwise affected by corrupt practices. Many of the United States' closest allies and strategic partners use the FMS, the foreign military sales process, because it is the most transparent, accountable, and efficient way to obtain the best defense technologies and services in the world. The underlying design premise of modern U.S. defense equipment is that it is operated, sustained, maintained by effective institutions with a trained and educated workforce. The United States is committed to support beyond the delivery of technologies and training on those systems, recognizing everything a partner may need to successfully perform a security role, to include successfully developing, absorbing, employing, and sustaining capabilities. We assist partners in their efforts to improve the security sector governance and core management competencies necessary to effectively and responsibly address shared security challenges. Through this uniquely American approach, because our competitors do not do this, this is a uniquely American approach to security cooperation. The United States ensures its foreign partners receive all the necessary training, education, and institutional capacity to effectively employ and sustain U.S. origin defense equipment. In our Bureau, we also have placed a greater emphasis on institutional capacity building to strengthen partners' security sector governance. Our Global Defense Reform Program, GDRP, provides strategic advisory support to partner nations to work in institutions and areas that are susceptible to corruption, fraud, waste, abuse, and poor management. GDRP projects complementing DoD institutional capacity building efforts help to tackle corruption by establishing systems and building institutional capacity in several areas, including planning, budget, and financial management, human resource management, oversight, accountability, and interagency coordination, procurement, acquisitions. Creating systems of transparency and accountability in the security sector reduces opportunities for corruption that undermine democratic governance. We're also enhancing coordination with our colleagues in USAID and the Bureaus of Democracy, Human Rights and Labor, and International Narcotics and Law Enforcement, whose assistance programs help build the capacity of civil society, judicial and parliamentary institutions to oversee security institutions. Further, we've taken important strides in building new analytical frameworks using both internal U.S. government data and third-party sources like Transparency International's Government Defense Integrity Index, the GDI, to assess corruption risks and the strength of partners' overall security sector governance. It's still a work in progress, but we are seeking to institutionalize the integration of these evidence bases into the arms transfer review process. Finally, in those instances where U.S. companies seek formal U.S. government advocacy for foreign commercial defense procurements, a process that's managed by the Department of State's Advocacy Center, anti-corruption considerations are firmly embedded in that process. For instance, as a condition of receiving U.S. government advocacy, corporate officials must sign an agreement with Commerce in which they confirm that A, their company will not engage in the bribery of foreign public officials in connection with the project or the procurement, and B, they will maintain and enforce a corporate policy that prohibits the bribery of foreign public officials. Beyond this commitment by American firms, our whole of government advocacy efforts seek to level the playing field for US companies, countering corruption by encouraging transparency throughout the procurement process and aggressively addressing actual or suspected bribery and corruption by foreign firms and government officials as soon as it comes to our attention. Other efforts, such as enhancing training and educating the officers and workforce, both at state and DoD, who oversee security assistance and arms transfers, and developing a common operating picture across the entire security cooperation enterprise, pose longer-term challenges, but we're committed to advancing these shared objectives. I hope this overview gives you a better understanding of how the State Department is approaching corruption risks in the security sector, and I look forward to hearing your suggestions for how we can better tackle those risks together. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Mira. That was great. Really great to hear some detail about how the Biden administration is approaching corruption, and I'm sure we'll dig in deeper. I'd like to introduce our other panelists, and then we'll move forward with some questions back and forth, and then we'll get to questions from the audience. So first, Michael Picard is a consultant to Transparency International's Defense and Security Program. Transparency International got a shout out, as you saw in Mira's presentation. Michael's been researching private military contractors, and his prior work has focused primarily on small arms and light weapons and armed violence in Southeast Asia. We also have with us Jodi Vittori. She's a professor of practice and co-chair of the Global Politics and Security Program at Georgetown School of Foreign Service. She's an expert on the linkages of corruption, state fragility, illicit finance, and U.S. national security. She served in the U.S. Air Force, advancing to the rank of lieutenant colonel, served in Afghanistan, Iraq, South Korea, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Bahrain, and she was assigned to NATO's only counter-corruption task force. She's also founder of the Anti-Corruption Advocacy Network. So in short, we have a wealth of expertise here, and we have lots to talk about. So my first question, and this is something Mira addressed in some detail in her remarks, the invasion of Ukraine and the attempts to impose sanctions on Russia have kind of highlighted the role of corruption and the need to do things like shut off and seize resources of corrupt oligarchs and so forth. So are there any kind of mechanisms or practices exposed there, whether it be shadow corporations or kind of complicated banking and financing arrangements and so forth, things that have come up in the context of the Ukraine crisis that are applicable more broadly to dealing with arms trade and security assistance issues? So whoever wants to take that, have at it.
Good morning. I'll take that if it's okay, Bill.
Oh, please do.
So thanks for the great and very long introduction. And thanks again to Deputy Assistant Secretary Resnick for the great remarks. And it's amazing to see what the administration has been doing on the security assistance side. And she did a great, as we expect, overview of the ways that corruption links to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and some of the areas that we can work on to help not only deal with the Russia-Ukraine issue, but also to harden our military and our national security against similar uses by countries like China, countries like the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and so forth, is well documented in open source intelligence or open source media reports and so on. So not only is the role of Russia as a kleptocracy, which means rule by thieves, important in how corruption has happened in the war in Ukraine, but also, of course, she highlighted beautifully the role that corruption plays for Russia to use strategic corruption in its so-called near abroad. Part of its strategy, not the only part of its strategy, to kind of keep docile leaders of places like Ukraine in line. And as the populations rose up against those groups that wanted to be more linked to the West, not so much linked to kleptocracy in the East, then Putin started more and more using violence to kind of try to bring those groups back. But there's a third pillar also needs to be discussed, and that's the role of dirty and dubious money when it comes to Russia's use of foreign policy in the West itself or throughout the world, but I'm going to focus specifically on the West. We have lots of examples of where strategic corruption has been used, often through the very oligarchs that she talked about, to help either undermine Western policies or at least keep things off the agenda. And a couple of these can have really big strategic ramifications coming up when it comes to dealing with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Of course, the one that everybody's watching right now is Marine Le Pen in France. As the Financial Times pointed out last week, back in 2014, as part of a thank you for Marine Le Pen's support for supporting the invasion of Crimea by Russia at the time, and also because, frankly, her political party was broke. Nobody wanted to give money to a political party that was that far right wing. She received a loan from a Russian intermediary bank in the Czech Republic. As the Financial Times reported, she still owes him money back. She still owes the Russian regime back. As one of the key pillars of NATO, as one of the key providers of weapons, both weapons sales prior to 2014 that were going to Russia itself in the form of submarines, but also their role in NATO today as a major power and nuclear power. Obviously, this is something that should be very concerning to the NATO alliance, to how we understand the NATO alliance. She's talking about pulling France back out of at least certain aspects of the NATO alliance if she's elected. We also in 2020, for example, had the British Parliamentary Security Committee report that discussed their concerns about the role of Russian influence in particularly the House of Lords and its larger, sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Its role in undermining particularly the House of Lords, certain political parties with political campaign donations. It's not illegal for members of the House of Lords to actually sit on Russian boards of companies, which should be highly concerning. In our own country, of course, we've had the Paul Manafort scandals. We've had scandals with those associated with Rudy Giuliani, of course, with the first impeachment. So there are also concerns in our own country. And so there's a couple areas that we could look at closing off some of these avenues for illicit money and how they can undermine American and Western national security. And I'll talk about them briefly. I'm happy to talk about more in the question and answer session. One is, Treasury has been at the forefront lately of publishing rules ending anonymous shell companies. The draft rules have been published. They're coming out with the final rules soon. And so it would be incredibly important if those rules be as strong as possible. There was some wiggle room in legislation to bring in things like hedge funds that are also incredibly useful for money laundering. And so it'd be important to close those off. Second is real estate. The role of real estate in money laundering was recognized all the way back in the Patriot Act, back in 2001. But the real estate sector, the luxury boat sector, the aircraft sector, they were given exceptions to the Patriot Act in 2002 for not having to do due diligence on their customers. And of course, as we're chasing Russian yachts and aircraft, many of those aircraft with an N designation, which means it's a US registered aircraft, we're seeing the results of that. So again, there's been a draft rule put out by Treasury. Having the strongest possible rules put out with all deliberate speed to close those off are going to be incredibly important. And then third is implementing to the greatest extent possible Section 885 of the fiscal year 2021 National Defense Authorization Act. This was requirements in the NDAA that says that any federal contracts, they have to identify their beneficial owners of any contractors or subcontractors. This would be incredibly important to use, to be implemented right away, and to make that information public. So it could be made public on the FAPAS website. And when those companies receive US government contracts, making that information part of USA Spending, the much easier to access public website that most of the US population in the world can look at, so that we can make sure that the US government isn't accidentally working with Russian oligarchs, Chinese oligarchs, any other oligarchs out there. So thank you very much for giving me a chance to talk.
Can I add in?
Go ahead. Yeah, please do.
Yeah. So also, I just want to echo what Jodi said. Thank you so much for this opportunity. This is a great chance to talk about some very important issues. If we are talking about countering oligarchs and corrupt influence in the arms trade, I would just re-emphasize that investigating beneficial ownership networks and corporate partnerships in the defense sector is really critical right now. Given how integrated and interconnected the global defense industry is, US firms and citizens engaged in the arms trade in countries we consider quite friendly might in fact be exposed to corrupt and kleptocratic networks. So to give you a small example, and Jodi already mentioned the UAE, we focus quite closely on the UAE's defense industry, which is very dynamic, largely because of the knowledge, the connections, the expertise of American defense entrepreneurs and contractors. I mean, it's worth remembering that this is where Eric Prince exiled himself after he was barred from working with the US government, and he's worked quite closely with Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan. So there's a big American overlap there. At the same time, the Emirati defense sector, at least until very recently, collaborated closely with Russian and Belarusian arms manufacturers. I mean, we've seen joint ventures, technology transfers, financing and investment in each other's arms industries. The Pentagon even assessed in 2020 that the UAE may have financed the Wagner private military company's operations in Libya. So these obscure connections, they can expose the US, they can empower kleptocrats, and of course they undermine international security. So this is really where we think the US should be pushing for greater transparency.
Let me
Thanks very
jump
much.
in on a couple of Russia points. I spoke about our efforts to hunt down assets of oligarchs, and we've also imposed sanctions on dozens of Russian defense sector related entities, individuals in response to Ukraine invasion. Those actions follow implementation of the 2017 CATSA law, which is the Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, that requires sanctions on significant transactions with Russia's defense and intelligence sectors. This is important because these funds fuel Russia's unprovoked and unjustified war in Ukraine. And this is critical when we're working with partners to shut down this lifeline to Russia. The other issue I would raise here with respect to Russia is the instances of corruption in Russia's defense sector. They have used bribery and other corrupt practices to promote their own arms exports. So pushing back on Russia's arms trade globally, therefore, not only imposes costs on Moscow for its malign activities in Ukraine and elsewhere, but also makes our partners less vulnerable to the risks of involvement with Russia-related corruption and its unwanted side effects in their own countries.
Thank you all. Another demonstration of why we invited these folks was the amount of rich information and analysis. So another angle on corruption, as we all know, especially in the last couple of decades, there's been a huge surge in the use of private military contractors, most visibly in Iraq and Afghanistan, but elsewhere around the world, and not just by the United States. So how do we see the use of contractors, the pluses and minuses, and in particular, their potential role in enabling corruption? And maybe since Michael's looked at this, we'll start with him, but we'll throw it open to the whole panel as well.
Great, thanks a lot, Bill. So I actually just saw someone in the comments sort of mentioned, we're talking a lot about Russian and Chinese oligarchs, but sort of what's the American side of this? And I think this is sort of something where really the American side is very important and something that needs to be considered with a lot of scrutiny. So before I tackle that question, I just want to kind of provide a quick synchronizing overview of what's actually meant by that term, private military security companies, because it's quite vague and nebulous. And I also want to talk about why this topic matters. So when I say a PMSC or like a private military contractor or something like that, I'm basically talking about combat operations. So this includes military training. This includes intelligence collection, logistics and support, armed physical security, extending all the way into the activities of the cyber domain. What's important here is the fact that there is coercive force at some point in supply chain, not whether it's used in an offensive or a defensive way, because these things become really blurry in reality. And also this is important because the private military security industry is here to stay. Market research firms estimate that this industry is worth over $200 billion and is slated to expand considerably over the next decade. On top of that, the US has a huge stake in this industry as both a consumer and a supplier of PMSC services. The US government basically created this industry in its present incarnation and still relies heavily on these companies for military and national security matters. But we are at an inflection point. With the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan largely in the rearview mirror, much of the industry is losing its biggest client. Now, the US is still by far the largest single consumer of PMSE services, but this trend is nevertheless worrying because while some firms will contract and others might leave the market altogether, others are seeking out new work with dubious new clients. And sort of, I mentioned earlier, Eric Prince, but give you another example. Just last year, it was revealed that a US PMSE provided combat training to operatives in the Saudi unit that killed Jamal Khashoggi shortly before his gruesome assassination. So with that as kind of some scoping or framing of the issue, I want to turn to the question, Bill, that you asked, to PMSEs and corruption, to private military contractors and corruption. And then I want to talk about how the US and the international community are addressing and not addressing some of these issues. So at Transparency, we've been asking the question, how do private military and security contractors, companies, play into corruption? And how do they play into conflict by way of corruption? And the image that's emerged is that they are a really particular kind of enabler, that they are very well placed as an intermediary to enable corruption at all levels in many different directions. So to give you an example of some of the ways they do that, they can facilitate grant corruption and capture natural resources, the extractive industries for corrupt officials and kleptocrats. I mean, this is what we see currently with Wagner in Syria and Libya. This is what we saw throughout the 90s and the early 2000s with British and South African PMSEs throughout Africa and in the Pacific. Second off, PMSEs can win lucrative state contracts through bribing local officials and redistributing them to politically connected subcontractors through kickbacks. PMSEs can inflate threat perceptions to expand contracts. I think we've all heard of sort of these cases in Afghanistan, of local security providers hiring militants to stage attacks on NATO convoys just to elevate the degree of insecurity so that they could get more contracts. On top of that, PMSEs can exploit chaotic environments to overcharge on their contracts or engage in subversive activity, such as engaging in combat or engaging in illicit economies like human trafficking. This just scratches the surface. I'm going to stop there, but these are all things we have seen in the past 20 years and continue to see. The point is, this is a sector and an industry that has profound corruption risks, and it raises the question, what is the US, what is the international community doing about it? So I'm just going to quickly wrap up with a brief overview of that, of sort of, what the US and the international community are doing, but also where the weaknesses are. So on the international level, the key regulatory initiative to know about is the Mantra document. This was a voluntary, non-binding document promoted by the Swiss government and the Red Cross in 2008. And its goal was to extend international humanitarian law and best practices to PMSEs and the states that contract and host them. There's also, in parallel, a UN process that is seeking to distinguish PMSEs from mercenaries and push for new norms, a new normative framework to match the modern reality. But there are issues with both initiatives. The former, the Mantra document, is weak. It never evolved beyond a voluntary non-binding document that could reform both the countries and the PMSEs that needed it most. And the UN process is stalled and vulnerable to a lot of foot dragging by states in the industry who perceive their interests as threatened. So here we think the US can do a lot more. Now, regarding regulation in the US, this will be my last comments on this. There is no comprehensive regulatory mechanism for US private military and security contractors. There are smaller mechanisms that cover important but limited aspects of the industry, but it is a very, very piecemeal approach. So these smaller mechanisms, what are they? One is defense export controls, which I'm not going to touch on, but I will talk about the second, which is US government contracting. So as we all know, the US government is the single largest consumer of these services. But there's still weaknesses within this sort of framework, within this control mechanism that can be exploited by corrupt PMSEs. For example, each US government agency has different approaches and processes to contracting these companies, contributing to, again, to the more piecemeal approach. To give you an example, the guidance documents provided by the Department of Defense to its contracting officials extensively cover contractor corruption and all the ways this can appear, while those of the Department of State seem to treat it as a more limited risk and issue. Second off, there's no comprehensive monitoring of PMSE use by the US government. So even within the Pentagon, monitoring is fragmented and inconsistent with different commands and different sub-organizations using different metrics and indicators. So none of it actually speaks to to each other. So no one at the Pentagon could tell you how many private military security contractors they are hiring, that they are using. And finally, contractor oversight suffers from chronic weakness. This means understaffing. This means undertraining. This means constant reorganization and constant disruption. And to give you an example, last year, the Government Accountability Office found that 13%, which is not insignificant, of private military security contractors hired by the Pentagon did not have the certifications required under US law, largely because the staff handling these contracts weren't properly trained. So I'll leave it at that. But I really hope that Mrs. Resnick could maybe tell us a little more about defense export controls and how her office overlaps and intersects with some of these issues, if at all. And of course, because Jodi indoctrinated me on a lot of these things, I'd love to hear some of her thoughts and comments on this.
Thank you.
I'm happy to go next. Thanks, Michael, for those comments. And I'll also start with a response to the comment about hearing more about American warts and all. And I think it may be appropriate here for me to share a portion of Secretary Blinken's remarks in the rollout of the Human Rights Report this week, which was on Tuesday, and the full remarks are on the website. But he said, "We've acknowledged from day one of this administration that we have challenges here in the United States. We take seriously our responsibility to address these shortcomings, and we know that the way to do it matters. Together with citizens and communities, out in the open, transparently, not trying to pretend problems don't exist or sweeping them under a rug. And in fact, that's what distinguishes democracies: our willingness, our commitment to pursue that more perfect union, and practicing what we preach at home gives us greater legitimacy when we encourage governments abroad to do the same thing." And I would say that a main goal of this administration has been to return to our ability to have the moral high ground. Let me turn to PMSCs in Russia. The department is deeply concerned by the continuing destabilizing engagement in numerous regional conflicts by the Kremlin-backed Wagner Group. Prigozhin, who's been sanctioned by the US, the UK, and most recently the EU, he seeks to build his own influence and his own wealth, often targeting control of mineral resources in the countries in which he operates. Prigozhin and the Wagner Group operate with direct influence from the Russian Federation. We've seen reports of the Russian Federation looking to bolster its numbers in Ukraine, including by the use of Wagner Group personnel. And if true, this would represent a further escalation in Putin's unjustified, unprovoked, premeditated war in Ukraine, and further show how the Russian Federation is pulling from its destructive, destabilizing Syria playbook. The Russian Federation's focus should be on stopping the war it started rather than bringing more suffering to the people of Ukraine. More broadly, as Michael mentioned, the department continues to regulate the furnishing of military training by U.S. persons to foreign units and forces through its administration of the ITAR, the International Traffic in Arms Regulations. And the department reviews license applications to furnish defense services overseas, as well as potential ITAR violations involving the unauthorized furnishing of defense services on a case-by-case basis, with a particular focus on the foreign policy and national security interests of the United States. We have multiple civil enforcement options available against U.S. persons who furnish defense services without authorization in violation of the ITAR, including monetary penalties and debarment. The Arms Export Control Act also provides criminal penalties of up to 28 years imprisonment and $1 million per violation. And we work closely with federal law enforcement to support criminal prosecutions. On the effectiveness here, we're required, all U.S. persons that furnish defense services overseas, including PMSCs, are required to register with the Department of State, the Directorate of Defense Trade Controls, that's DDTC, and obtain a license before furnishing such services. Michael raised a few cases here. I can't comment on these specific cases, but I can give you a sense of our process. So DDTC learns of U.S. persons who have or who are furnishing defense services overseas without proper registration and authorization from the State Department through Blue Lantern end use monitoring, from embassies, from media reports, tips from industry, public, intel, overall all source reporting to identify active activities of registrants and license holders, and of course those who have failed to perform those steps. We hear from civil society, we hear from the press, and these are really important in a democracy. in these instances, without getting into specifics, we've taken a variety of actions on the basis of that kind of all source information. Specifically, DDTC may pursue a civil enforcement action against them, including monetary penalties and administrative debarment. And in the event that DDTC learns of US persons furnishing defense services that may be criminal in nature, DDTC refers such cases to the FBI, to Homeland Security investigations for investigation and potential criminal prosecution.
Thank you. Jodi, did you want to add anything on that, or should we move to the next?
No, great comments, and I appreciate what Mira has brought out. Just a couple of quick things to note. Michael's done a great job on highlighting that US Congress and the executive branch has hammered down quite a bit on any private military security companies that engaged in illegal activities, particularly since legislation since 2005, if they're on a US government contract. But there are some really big concerns if organizations are involved with training, are involved with advising, not technically private military security company activities, or if the individuals aren't going armed as part of their private military security company activities. What is incredibly normal in private military security company activities, if they're working on behalf of another state, is that the individuals will go and not be armed, but they will pick up their arms with the state that they're working with. This was, for example, what happened with Eric Prince's contract with Colombians and others that he was working with in the United Arab Emirates. That was highlighted in the 2011 New York Times reporting for Rapid Reflexes private military security company. They weren't actually going over technically to be involved in military activity. They weren't carrying arms or exporting arms with them. Those were being provided by the United Arab Emirates country. So those sorts of loopholes really need to be closed because there's not a real clear understanding of what US persons involved in private military security company activity, particularly non-US companies, are doing. The second one is, I'll just note, particularly we talked about Wagner, but this tight role between private military security companies, natural resource related extraction firms and shipping, and armed conflict. It first is a model that comes out with Executive Outcomes, which is a South African private military security company, and its associated spin-off firms. It's very easy to spin off firms off these core private military security companies. It's very, very common. And we see this with Wagner, where Wagner goes in and they both work on extraction of oil or minerals, and that's part of their payment. And then they secure the locations. The classic example was Avropolis, which was a natural resource company from Russia. It's tied with Wagner. So Wagner goes in and takes a key location for oil, gas, or mining. It protects it. In return, Avropolis goes in. They have the right to take a certain percentage of the oil, gas, or mining profits from that. That incentivizes, of course, these were in Syria. This incentivizes these private military security companies to have conflict in the area. They don't keep getting paid if they're not guarding the area. It means that those resources aren't going out in a clear and transparent manner. They're going into the pockets of the Assad regime. They're going into the pockets of groups like Avropolis. They're building up the Syrian security forces by doing these activities. And it means that if Syria, in this case, was short of cash, they could trade off the oil in return for private military companies instead of actually having to pay them. It's a way to get around things like sanctions. Other companies have done this as well. This, like I said, Executive Outcomes started doing this in places like Angola. And there are concerns that these are the kinds of activities that Blackwater spinoff companies may have been engaged in. Well, it's very, very common. So it's important that the United States also look at extractive industries transparency. We used to be a model of this in 2010 with Dodd-Frank Section 1504. In the early days of the Trump administration, literally in less than 10 business days, a unique form of legislation lifted what had been a relatively strong rule on US companies reporting their oil, gas, and mining activities in a public manner way that put the United States in compliant with the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. They sent the SEC back to go make a new rule. That new rule that came out was incredibly weak. So because of the role that natural resources are playing in private military security companies for Wagner, for all sorts of companies out there, the United States needs to also be focusing on what can it do about natural resource activity. This is especially important. The Century put out a really important op-ed in Time magazine last week. I would encourage people to take a look at, for example, on how this sort of activity with Wagner in places like Central African Republic and Mali can be using to get around Russian sanctions, those very oligarch sanctions that Assistant Secretary Resnick put out there. So this sort of holistic all-of-government approach of not only Russian oligarchs, but larger oligarchy throughout the world, there's a lot of areas that really need to be focused on from a national security perspective.
Thanks. So the next question was actually already asked by one of the participants, the audience. So kind of serves two purposes. We're going to do it anyway, and now we're also answering the question. So it has to do with offsets. Basically there's sort of quid pro quos where the supplier nations and companies invest in or outsource work to recipient nations to help offset the cost of buying a major weapon system. These arrangements are fairly poorly understood. They're not often discussed. But could we talk a little bit about what they are and also their role as kind of enablers of corruption? And I thought we'd start with Jodi, since you've done a ton of work on this.
Thanks. I appreciate that. Offsets is one of those areas that's really wide open for that, the fifth pillar of U.S. Anti-corruption national security strategy, one of those areas that really should be covered. So offsets themselves don't necessarily have to be bad. What an offset is that when a country is going to buy a bunch of arms from any other country, they want to offset some of the foreign currency that they're going to be sending to the exporting country. And so they come with unique ways. So the first offsets were in the 1950s. When the United States was allowing the German government to rearm, Germany was buying a bunch of aircraft. This was going to be real expensive for Germany that was still very poor. So they made a deal that said, if they buy these American aircraft, then some of the maintenance and stuff is going to be done in Germany itself. So it's going to train people, it's going to employ people, it's going to build their industry. It's not economically efficient, but you can understand the political sense that goes into that. So they don't necessarily have to be bad. If they're done in a very transparent way, there's some political expediency, what we call direct offsets, like the example I've given in the German case of having some local maintenance and stuff that can often make political sense. But that's only about a third of offsets as far as we know. Most offsets are what we call indirect offsets, which means the offset contract, this side sweetener deal to a large defense contract, may have nothing whatsoever to do with the actual contract itself. And many countries require defense offset contracts as sweeteners and as part of the actual bidding processes for weapons procurement. And these contracts can be secret. Matter of fact, revealing information about these contracts in places like the United Arab Emirates, those are considered state secrets. So they can be 30 to 60% of the value of the contract. So if you have in UAE, for example, if there's a $10 million contract, you have to have offsets worth or 60% of that. So you owe $6 million in some sort of combination of direct and offset contracts. That's a massive amount of money in large secret contracts for large, often secret procurements. We know in any situation that when you have large amounts of secret contracts going on with no requirements for beneficial ownership, that this is a possibility for corruption, for patronage, for kickbacks. There's all sorts of possibilities there. And there's no real way to watch these offset contracts in many countries because they do make it illegal to provide any information about them. And the amount of offset contracts worldwide are massive. We don't know exactly how much is out there because these contracts are secret, but we can get bits and pieces of this from some reporting, some media, some information that is provided to the Department of Commerce every year. So a consultancy called Avocent estimates that the worldwide value of offsets between 2021 and 2025 is $371 billion during that 4-year period. Again, about 2/3 of those will be the indirect offsets, a third will be the direct ones. So if you think about it, we don't know what, if any, percentage goes to corruption or kickbacks. But even if just 10% of those go to kickbacks or corruption or patronage, I mean, we're looking at $37 billion over 4 years. That's a lot of money. And these can incentivize and lead to really bad national security issues, to conflict and warfare type issues. And I want to give a couple examples real quick. Between 1999 and 2005, Then Deputy President Jacob Zuma in South Africa was heavily involved in massive levels of corruption associated with various arms contracts, particularly aerospace contracts. These are the most common types of contracts to have large scale offsets, I should note. And this was with companies like Thales, with companies like BAE. He currently has been on trial for years regarding the 400 plus indictments for corruption. As he was arrested last year, if you remember, there was massive rioting in South Africa. In large part, it was a way of trying to get him released and having the trial go. Basically using his supporters to say, if you arrest me and you investigate my corruption associated with these arms deals, then I'm going to make the country ungovernable. I'm going to burn the place down. And so these contracts, a whole lot of what was involved with the corruption in these contracts was defense offsets. Obviously, South Africa is an incredibly strategically important country for the United States, for the rest of the world, for the African continent. And so having this kind of corruption that can be wrapped into defense offsets is very, very dangerous for anybody's national security and national stability. But they can also have international security issues. There are defense offsets, these secret offset contracts can be associated with warfare outside of the state's borders. One example of this is as some information does come out of UAE regarding its offset contracts. And in that example, for example, there's a company called Horizon Flight Academy. Horizon Flight Academy is actually one of the main helicopter training programs in the Middle East. It's a very legitimate training program. It trains civilian pilots, but it also trains the UAE helicopter pilot force. Unfortunately, UAE's helicopters have been involved in a number of instances of attacks against civilians, civilian fishing vessels, and others that have been described by groups like Human Rights Watch as potentially being human rights abuses. Though Horizon Flight Academy was funded initially by a series of offset contracts. That's how they got their start. And those were wrapped, by the way, in through large-scale sovereign wealth funds of UAE, because those sovereign wealth funds oftentimes are linked to the defense offset programs there. There's a third way to do defense offset contracts, and that is also sometimes cash. In 2016, the United Arab Emirates gave a briefing to various defense industry groups, saying that in lieu of setting up joint ventures, businesses, or whatever, they would be accepting cash in lieu of the offsets in some situations with what's called a multiplier of 6. So if you hypothetically had a $10 million defense contract with UAE, instead of setting up $6 million of joint ventures or maintenance facilities or whatever in the UAE, with that multiplier of 6, instead of owing $6 million, you could just pay them $1 million in cash to an offset budget account. And that would take care of your offset, which while the UAE authority stated was not in violation of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and that was something they specifically highlighted in their meeting, it does violate the entire tenet of offsets, which is to help employ individuals, build technology, deal with balance of payments issues in the state. Cash really undermines that. Going back to my hypothetical $10 million contract, instead of just accepting $1 million in cash offsets, that $1 million goes into off-budget funds, why didn't they just pay $9 million for the contract? That would have made a lot more sense, and spent the $1 million they saved going through a parliamentary process to decide where that money could best be well spent. So highly questionable. At least through 2019, those cash-based rules were still in effect in the UAE. There's big concerns anytime you have very secret contracts, large amounts of money. There is no beneficial ownership requirements in many of these states of who gets the contracts. So it could be the brother-in-law of the Minister of Defense. We don't know. We can't tell what went in there. We don't know the pricing information. Maybe a widget that costs $10 is really being charged $50 for, and $40 is going, to whoever on the side. There is very little information on any of that. So moving to what we can do about these sorts of issues. One is that, with the sanctioning Russian oligarchs, we've recognized the need to understand better these large anonymous sorts of funding streams and financing streams in the world. We focus on real estate, anonymous shell companies, public hedge funds, the yachts, the private aircraft. We need to have transparency and accountability of these financial instruments associated with offset accounts as well, particularly the indirect offsets that aren't specifically linked to the actual contract itself. And so Congress needs to ask for much more information. And that information needs to be public, just like a beneficial ownership information of limited liability companies needs to be public. Again, when it comes to foreign military sales contracts associated with offsets, that's section 885, where one has to declare the offsets and the beneficial ownership information of those defense offsets and the subcontractors associated with an FMS sale. Could be a backdoor to get through at least some of that information that's already been legislated for. It doesn't take advantage of, it can't help direct commercial sales or other areas, but it would help fix that one area. Additionally, the Congress does receive some information on offsets. They get a summary. There could be, Congress can ask for more information about those offsets, but that offset information is classified confidential, so the public can't get it. So putting those summaries out, making them public, who are the beneficial ownerships, who are the subcontractors, what is the pricing information, particularly for the indirect offset contracts, is really important. And I'll close with just one example of just what sort of things these indirect offset contracts can include. There was an indirect offset contract in Saudi Arabia between Raytheon and Thales for a sale to Saudi Arabia of arms. Part of the indirect offset contract was to set up a shrimp farm in Saudi Arabia. That's what I mean by how indirect these offsets can be. You can, that Raytheon's not in the business usually of shrimp farms. The shrimp farm itself, about 20% of the funds of the shrimp farm, or the owner of the shrimp farm, was the Saudi brigadier general who had just retired from being in charge of offsets. The financial firm that handled the capital, he had about 45% of the shares in the company that handled the capital financing for that shrimp farm. This is the type of stuff that, the Saudi citizens should have a right to know why a shrimp farm is being built on their behalf as part of a U.S. arms deal, and why the recently retired brigadier general in charge of offsets, his companies are incredibly tied to those sorts of companies. That completely legal. For the U.S. has made offsets completely legal, but it certainly is the type of thing that requires additional transparency and can be used for patronage of actors that maybe we don't want to be patronized, and can undermine democracy, accountability, and frankly, the budgets of states associated with it.
Yes. Well, the good news is I think there'll be a recording of this, so all that rich material can be extracted in various forms. But thanks for that. So we've already done a fair amount of this along the way, but the last thing we wanted to talk about before we turn to audience questions was recommendations. Are there 2 or 3 things in this sort of area we've covered that you think would be most important, or maybe most feasible to do in the short to medium term? So anybody who wants to jump in first.
I'll take a crack at it. But first off, I just want to say, kind of, follow up on what Jodi was saying. I want to do a shameless plug about some Transparency International resources. Some things that my colleagues have been working really hard on are the Government Defense Integrity Index, the GDI, which Mira mentioned, and I'm thrilled to hear that your office is using that. So thank you for that. But then also the Defense Companies Index. Both of these things look at defense offsets. Both of these things shed some light on this otherwise very opaque but very important sort of aspect of the defense trade. And it's something that I think, companies need to do more about. And as well, the government needs to factor into its sort of decisions and who it's going to work with and whatnot. So just sort of wanted to mention those things before we move on. As for the recommendations, therefore, I think I'm just going to rifle through really quickly. First, the US government needs to reinforce its baseline of anti-corruption measures in government contracting. I mean, again, I think the US has, a role and a space in sort of the anti-corruption fight, and a lot of this means looking sort of inward and whatnot. So this means fully implementing existing laws governing PMSCs and other government contractors in the defense sector. This means standardizing anti-corruption measures between agencies and how they contract private military security contractors. This means new measures, expanding scrutiny on beneficial ownership, on subcontractor networks and on corporate partnerships. Secondly, the US government needs to expand monitoring and reporting on its own contractor use. As I mentioned, the lack of tracking by the US government on PMSCs makes it very hard to assess the risks and the full extent of the issues that I was talking about earlier. Above all, the Department of Defense and the Department of State need to coordinate the manner in which they track their own PMSC use and make these statistics available to Congress and to the public. Mira, I think you mentioned earlier sort of about having a common operating picture sort of across, let's say, outward-facing anti-corruption efforts. I think this is also needed sort of within the contracting space of the US government. Third, we think there needs to be more international engagement. There's a lot of foot dragging in the international fora that are trying to build a more meaningful normative framework. And as I said earlier, the US has a lot of clout here as both the biggest consumer and supplier of these defense contractor services. The US is in a good position to push greater international cohesion and some progress on these important issues. And finally, Mira, again, you mentioned that sort of there's been an anti-corruption coordinator appointed to implement the US anti-corruption strategy. That's excellent. And that's something we think needs to happen as well, or at least extend to the contracting space. We think that there needs to be high-level coordination between agencies and efforts and how they contract defense contractors. So this could be an interagency working group led by a senior official who can coordinate the implementation and the streamlining of US laws and regulations, as well as invigorating international advocacy efforts. This was actually something that existed in the past. It was done by a relatively senior Pentagon official, but he was cut during the Trump years. And so we think this is really something that should be brought back.
Hey, thanks. I'm trying to answer a few of the questions on the side and also some other recommendations more broadly. One is dealing specifically with Ukraine. Nobody wants to slow down. Oh, okay, I shouldn't say. I would never, ever want to slow down the arms going into Ukraine. They need to go as fast as possible, particularly given the sort of genocidal language that historians like Tim Snyder have brought out, the fact that Russia is clearly not interested in negotiating, and that means that resolution will have to come, unfortunately, on the battlefield. But because arms in the defense sector historically is one of the most corrupt sectors that we've seen, is well acknowledged for linked to corruption over time. I gave some examples earlier. The importance of keeping an eye on what's going through the US pipelines and Western pipelines early on in a non-intrusive way is important, not only for just documenting what's going on and being clear, but because if those exports are being watched, it's more likely to be stolen to begin with. So establishing a special inspector general for any large scale US security assistance program, but particularly with Ukraine, now would be the time to do that. Unfortunately, if Ukraine does get bogged down into more of a trench related warfare, given the Russians digging in the east and the south in Ukraine, the longer the war goes on, the more that bad actors can be incentivized, unfortunately, and to undermine the incredible work that the Ukrainian citizens are doing to defend their own sovereignty and to defend their own democracy. So it's important that having a special inspector general and the intelligence communities with PIR, with the priority intelligence reports, can be working ahead of time to monitor that, to nip issues in the bud. You don't really know where they're going to show up, but the reality in any warfare is while 99% of the population is decimated, there's always a small number that do really well by warfare and have incentive to keep it going. So monitoring for those and dealing with those early, I think that's one of the big lessons from Afghanistan. We didn't set up a special inspector general until it was far, far too late. We kind of tried to close some of the barn door ever so slightly long after the horses had already left. So setting up those special inspector general programs. Also, more protections for media watchdog and civil society. So much has been discussed, and rightfully, there's been a lot more money and support for media and civil society, but it is so dangerous to report on these things, particularly on security sectors, because by definition, they're the guys with the guns who can shoot you. Very, very dangerous. Having a lot more diplomatic support to provide assistance to those reporting on corruption within states is important. We've got Nigerian activists, for example, who right now are finding themselves in just sort of fake arrests and being kind of whirled around the Nigerian court system to sort of punish them for bringing up corruption related to OPL 245. We've got the Italian judges or Italian prosecutors who may be under pressure in Italy for the same OPL 245 case. So having that really strong diplomatic report of telling countries this is not acceptable behavior to go after those who are trying to highlight or prosecute corruption in any form is going to be incredibly important. And even more so in the Ukraine situation. I applaud the intelligence community for putting out the fact that specifically anti-corruption activists were being targeted in Ukraine by Russia's kill capture lists. I think that's great, and I applaud it so that they can be prepared ahead of time. But a more robust actual protection for those individuals, being able to bring them to safety when needed, helping get them out of jail when governments go after them is going to be incredibly important. And then finally, the United States is doing its year of action as part of the Summit of Democracy and really making that security sector rules and mores, transparency and accountability, and civilian control over militaries to be really an incredible pillar of that Summit of Democracy year of action, of convening international groups, of what do we do about things like offsets? What do we do about things like arms procurement, arms trade, the brokers that deal with those arms trade? How do we minimize the ability for political gifts, for patronage, for the lack of beneficial ownership, for the lack of parliamentary oversight often of military procurements? This would be really a great area for the United States to regain its lead as the anti-corruption country that it was prior to, particularly until about 2010, 2015, to bring that back forward. This would be a great use for that anti-corruption pillar for the Summit of Democracy, I'd argue.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Mira. Yeah.
Oh, sure. So let me just start by addressing a little bit of the previous question on offsets, because I just want to clarify that the U.S. government doesn't play a role in the negotiation of offsets. That's according to the law, the 1992 amendment to the Defense Production Act. But when partners or potential partners have unfair offset laws or regulations that may prevent the U.S. from competing, we ask industry to make us aware of those issues. Our goal is always to ensure that the U.S. is able to compete on a level playing field, not least of which because we know that our strategic competitors are engaged in corrupt practices when it comes to offsets that prevent fair competition. So, to Jodi's point, we welcome sunlight on these issues so that we have a better understanding of what those offset requirements are. On recommendations, I'll point out the obvious. The U.S. government needs to continue prioritizing the fight against corruption as a core national security interest and effectively implement the countering corruption strategy. And to Jodi's point, support to civil society and journalists is a key line of effort in the anti-corruption strategy. So looking forward to full implementation there. It's a comprehensive strategy, but it's going to require that long-term effort. And to make a strategic impact, it's going to have to be a bipartisan priority that endures across administrations. And that will be up to the demands of Congress. That will be up to the demands of civil society and the public. So continue to stay engaged on those issues. More specifically to the defense, trade, and security assistance, we need to continue to build our data sets relating to corruption so that we can make evidence-based decisions about arms transfers and assistance programs. Many of you in this forum are already doing great work in that, and I want to thank Jodi and Bill and Michael for all of their efforts there. We encourage everyone to continue that work and maintain an open dialogue with the U.S. government about how practitioners can best leverage your research. There is definitely a strong appetite in the U.S. government and within state for data-driven diplomacy. At the same time, I see something of a gap between evidence of systemic and institutional corruption or public perception of corruption in a given country and the risk mitigation strategies for U.S. arms sales and security assistance programs. And this is something we need to work on. When we have specific credible allegations of corruption, we can take action to avoid working with that entity. And in the face of a generalized corruption risk, what can the U.S. government do to mitigate the risk that an arms transfer or security assistance program will contribute to corruption? What specific kinds of defense articles, if any, what specific kinds of defense services, if any, carry the greatest risk of harm in a corrupt political system? Which ones are relatively safe, if any? So I would suggest that one of the tasks before us is to develop a more granular shared understanding, perhaps based on specific case studies of how security assistance and arms sales can fuel corruption. And I hope that this forum can serve as a springboard for future conversations on the topic. And then lastly, I would touch on a point that Michael made, which is that that training is necessary for state and DoD officials that are making these kind of decisions, and we do need to invest more in training, and that is something that we are focused on today. And we would welcome, of course, any feedback from the audience and from my co-panelists to provide more granularity there.
Well, thank you all. We've gotten up to the question section, and there's a lot of good questions. We won't get to them all, but I wanted to start with one from Elias Youssef of the Stimson Center, asking about the revolving door issue, the movement of officials between government and the defense industry back and forth. And he gives one example of a chief lobbyist for the American Suppressor Association, went to work in the Trump administration, and he successfully pushed to overturn a ban on firearm silencers to private foreign buyers. And now he's back working for the lobby again. So, how do we prevent those kinds of things where you've got kind of a capturing of government policy by people with special interests?
I would really like to highlight the great work that the Project on Government Oversight has done on the revolving door. And they do have the revolving door tracker, and that may be where Elias got that particular example. A couple areas that good governance groups have highlighted for quite a while on the concerns about the revolving door, both writ large in government and specifically in the security sector. One is requiring that all that are leaving the high-level jobs, not just specifically contracting jobs, because people might be surprised at just how narrow who actually qualifies as potentially having a conflict of interest. As someone who had to fill out the paperwork herself when she left the military, I was shocked at how many possibilities there were to engage in activity that would be a potential conflict of interest that weren't covered by the current ethics paperwork. So requiring, tightening those down, making that information revolving door plans, if you will, public, having a stronger review for those revolving door plans going forward, and increasing the cooling off periods. There's a couple different trends of who goes through the revolving door, broadly speaking. There's the folks who go through the revolving door and sit on boards and stuff for decades, but an awful lot of those who go through the revolving door are only really useful for about 2 years until the Rolodexes start to expire, and then they tend to go off to other things. And that just highlights how most of that information is very time limited. So increasing the cooling off period gets you from, who you're just grabbing the Rolodex from versus who really, truly, probably more systemically has certain capabilities that you really do want to bring on your board. I mean, if you're doing high-tech work, bringing in individuals who've worked in high-tech stuff makes sense to an extent. The concern with the revolving door is that it's actually about getting additional contracts and stuff with that Rolodex that one has. So those would be some of the areas. Some of the other areas is that need much stronger tracking and legislation against those who revolve into foreign governments. We have individuals who've retired from the military who've gone on to lead, for example, the helicopter forces in a foreign country. You might give up, you might be amazed to know that's not illegal under most cases, unless you engage in that, for example, with North Korea or something like that. But in most countries, you can get away with that. These can obviously have really national security risks for the United States. So again, part of that revolving door needs to encompass more activity, more review by ethicists, making sure that it's not just a box ticking exercise, and bringing in where individuals are going from a foreign level in there as well. There has been some of that with the intelligence community very, very recently because of former high-level national security agency individuals who went off to go build a high-level surveillance capability for the United Arab Emirates government. So now there is some new legislation related to that, but that's a very narrow area, and it needs to be much broader on that. And I'm sure I see Pogo is on the Pogo is on the thing, so I'm sure they'll type some more recommendations in there as well.
Great. Any other panelists want to address that, or should we go to the next? All right. Well, that was very useful. I think a lot of good ideas there. Somebody asked about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. There used to be a time when U.S. companies literally would have middlemen handing out bags of cash to foreign officials to get them to buy U.S. weapons. The FCPA, I think, has cut pretty much back on that. There may be things happening we don't know about. But what does the act accomplish, and what's missing?
So the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act has been a landmark piece of legislation. And we were the first, if you want to be proud of being American, in 1977, we were the first country to make it illegal to bribe other people's officials. It had been illegal to bribe our own officials on a federal level since the 1850s, but it was illegal to bribe. It was not illegal, to bribe other countries' officials. And this had come out in the Church Committee hearings in the follow-on to Watergate and the Vietnam War. That just the massive national security issues it had with secret arms sales during the Vietnam War. Literally, the Japanese government fell when it came to light that Lockheed Martin and others were bribing the Japanese government to buy weapons that weren't necessarily what Japan needed. Obviously, having the government fall of a major ally because of corruption related to U.S. arms sales was a big problem. So that's where the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act largely came from. But there are some real holes in it. One of them is that defense offsets. Offsets are illegal under World Trade Organization regulations for every sector except defense. And the reason is because they're highly susceptible to corruption. The 1992 Defense Production Act that was rightly pointed out, which makes offsets legal, but keeps the government's hands off. The reason the government's hands were kept off is because they were recognized as distorting markets, which is the fancy way of saying they were worried about corruption at the time. And you can go back and look at some of the newspaper articles and stuff on the concerns of offsets at the time. So that's why the government has a hands-off approach to it. And it's been totally between the exporting company and the receiving company or country, depending on the type of arms sale. So this is recognized as a potential for corruption. These are two areas that need to be closed off. Another area that needs to be closed off is that bribe givers and their agents are covered under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, but not the bribe taker. So if you bribe officials to buy your weapons or the intermediaries involved, then you can be prosecuted. But if you're the person who takes the bribe, you are not. So there is legislation, the FIPA, Foreign Exploitation Prevention Act, Foreign Extortion Prevention Act, which would close off those sort of loopholes. And cut that loophole out of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It would make Deputy Secretary Resnick's life a little more tricky, because obviously those are often foreign officials that are taking the bribes, and thus that makes the U.S. Embassy there have to go deal with that issue of who's going to deal with a Saudi royal or something that just took bribes. That doesn't make her job any more fun. But the reality is, bribes work on a supply and demand level, and you can't just deal with the supply. You need to deal with the demand as well if you're really going to get to the situation of this. And then there's some important legislation called Klepto that was just put forward to Congress last week. The Enablers Act, which closed off a lot of the money laundering that makes bribes worthwhile. Taking the bribes is one thing, but you want to be able to spend that money. You don't just want to keep it under your mattress. And that's where money laundering comes in. So Enablers Act, Klepto Act would help close off the ability to use real estate to move things through lawyers, make lawyers do due diligence on the money that's coming through their accounts, hedge funds, family foundations, other foundations, charities, I believe is on there, closing off some of the loopholes on art. Basically, this attempt to take everything in the Pandora Papers and everything we've watched Russian oligarchs do and start to close off some of those money laundering capabilities that makes bribes literally worthwhile for those on the giving and receiving end.
Thank you.
Let me. I just want to add one point, and Jodi, that was really comprehensive. Just a little bit separate from this. one of the things that we're trying to do in the review of the CAP policy, of the conventional arms transfer policy, is try to conduct risk assessments about how the sale will contribute to various points in national security. And one of our data points is the risk that it would contribute to corruption, or the risk about security sector governance. So that's one of the things that we are trying to do in this review, to be able to incorporate some of those. So a country's record on foreign corrupt practices absolutely should play a role. So I want to thank Jodi for bringing that up, but it is something that we are constantly thinking about.
Great, thank you.
I appreciate it. And that's something, and I do want to highlight the importance of State Department having these discussions, starting these risk analysis, and hopefully setting those standards for things like other NATO countries, particularly as it looks like NATO is going to be expanding by at least 2 countries coming up pretty soon here with Finland and Sweden. As the international system totally changes, strategic corruption has been an important part of how one solidifies autocracies on one side and using strategic corruption to undermine Western democracies on the other. And Applebaum, the historian, has written about this excellently. Lots of great articles in The Economist and stuff highlight this. And so this is going to really have to be a key sector, and the security sector makes a main portion of that. So I'm thrilled with the Biden administration and the attention that they've given to it. And there's just some further steps that will have to go forward, but it really has been tremendous. Thank you.
Great. So for Mira Resnick, there was a question which in some ways has been answered partially by this forum itself, but was how civil society groups can best engage with the department on swapping ideas for reform. What's the sort of most productive way to engage and communicate on that?
Sure. So please reach out. We have conducted several forums already, as we have sought input from civil society on a number of policy changes that we are looking at, including the conventional arms transfer policy review. We are always looking to engage in the PM Bureau, but more broadly in the department with civil society, both American civil society and foreign civil society. I understand that when the secretary travels, he makes a point of meeting with civil society wherever he goes. Same with other 7th floor principals, senior officials at the State Department. So it is critical to us. We know that civil society is a core contributor to how we look at foreign policy and broader policies. And so we're really thankful for your input. Thanks.
Great, thanks. And then we had a question, in dealing with a corrupt partner nation, what's the sequencing? I mean, do you kind of engage, you sell them weapons, and then you sort of condition that on improvements in the future? Do you hold back entirely from selling to a corrupt regime? There may not be one answer, but what's the approach to that?
Sure. So again, there's not going to be one answer. We're looking at everything on a case-by-case basis. But the president has made it clear that the rule of law and respect for human rights are front and center in U.S. foreign policy. Anti-corruption efforts play a role in that. We insist on responsible use of U.S. origin defense equipment by our allies and our partners, and we would consider appropriate responses if violations occur. We have an established interagency process for working through the details of individual arms sales cases. We bring expertise, discipline, inclusivity into our policymaking process to ensure that we live up to the president's commitment. We want to make sure that our partners are complying with the laws of armed conflict, respect for human rights. We will consider the full range of consequences should violations occur. If we are looking at a partner that is willing to engage with us on security sector governance reform, we have a number of ways to do that. As I mentioned in my remarks, our GDRP program, by focusing on systems and processes, GDRP projects aim to build the resilience of U.S. partners and their security institutions, enhance effectiveness, accountability, better align the security sector to the needs and challenges of the partner and its citizens. So we are working with those partners to establish those systems. So for example, in the Balkans, a GDRP advisor assisted the MOD to develop a regulation requiring annual ethics training for all procurement personnel. In certain African partners, we've been working with them to increase transparency and efficiency around budgeting and human resources with the country's MOD to reform the heavily ground focused military as it's expanding its navy and better protect its maritime borders. So we have seen some good results from this work to prevent the risk of corruption and employ its resources to patrol the country's waters, reduce illicit activities, stimulate the local economy. We work with those countries, sometimes as a condition, sometimes as an addition.
Great, thank you. So we're getting towards the end, and most panels I've been involved in, each panelist gets 15 seconds at the end to give all their final remarks. So now we have a couple minutes each, which is expansive. So each of you, if you have any kind of major takeaways or final comments, let's have at it. I can call on people, or you can just say you said what you want to say. Michael, do you have any thoughts?
Sure. No. So first off, I just want to thank you all again for this really enlightening conversation. I've learned a lot personally just from hearing from my distinguished co-panelists. So really, thank you. Again, and I would also just sort of reiterate and reemphasize that, it's great to see that there's sort of a lot of initiative scrutinizing corruption sort of and its role in the international system. But, we also need to remember that this has an American component to it, and the US government needs to take sort of its contracting space very seriously, because sort of our research would suggest that has its weaknesses, and that can tie into international and domestic sort of corruption patterns and whatnot. Otherwise, if you guys are interested in this sort of topic, and I hope you are, specifically in private military security contractors, we have a report coming out this summer. This has sort of, been my sort of main focus for the past couple of years now with transparency, and I'm really excited for this to come out. So I hope you guys will, and I encourage you guys to read that. And then as well, if any of these sort of issues are of interest to you, again, I can't help but point you towards the GDI and the DCI. These are two Transparency International defense and security kind of products that sort of lay out all of these issues thematically, both on the government side and on the industry side, in a very comparative, user-friendly manner. And these are a very, I think, good way to sort of get started and start finding some generalizable indicators on these very complex issues. So yeah, again, everyone, thank you so much. This was really great.
Great, thanks. So Mira or Jodi, do you want to say a few final words, or?
I would like to leave here with the final comments.
Okay, go ahead, Jodi. Yeah, absolutely.
Sure. So just two areas that I would like to expand on. One is I would really love to see Congress require a 9/11 style inquiry into what happened with Kabul and security assistance versus what happened with Ukraine. It's only 7 months apart that in Kabul, a country that was well known for its high levels of corruption and defense-related corruption in particular, that received lots of US security assistance, known for its level of warlords and such, collapsed within 9 days from its first province to its capital, falling apart in part, not completely, because of corruption. Meanwhile, 7 months later, we have a country known for its corruption, particularly in its armed sector, who's received a lot of security assistance, who also has warlord problems and conflict, has done remarkably well in responding to an enemy, and not only not collapsing, but potentially looking at, it's even possible they could defeat the Russians, at least drive them back or make them no longer advance. So I think we need to better understand why security assistance worked in Ukraine and compared to what went so wrong in places like Mali and in Afghanistan, and use that as a way to go forward on our lessons learned. Two is, at the same time we're doing this, watching US nationals, watching for our own corruption. Right as we speak, there is a massive US military corruption trial going on called the Fat Leonard trial. It's going to be about a 2.5-month trial of corruption in the US Navy that goes all the way up to the top, where senior US naval officials and Navy law enforcement were taking bribes in the form of money, prostitutes, gifts, cool trips, crazy parties, in return for passing on classified information and setting up their training and other exercises in Asian countries to benefit this contractor, Malaysian contractor nicknamed Fat Leonard. There's a whole podcast by Project Brazen if you want to learn more about it, but it highlights that we have a real corruption problem in the US military. We have let our military law enforcement and its ability to track corruption and all sorts of other illicit activities has fallen apart, just like a lot of other law enforcement has on the federal level and going after corruption. And we really need to highlight and fix our own problems before, instead of making fun of the corruption in the Russian military, we might find ourselves in similar concerns. Thank you.
Great. Mira, do you want to say a word
Yeah.
before we?
Absolutely. So first, I just want to offer the engagement with us on your ideas, and we look forward to hearing from you. We look forward to implementing the anti-corruption strategy in full, working with civil society to ensure that that effort spans the test of time. Our national security interests rest on our ability to rely on our partners, and part of that is ensuring that our partners invest in their own anti-corruption efforts. So at a time when we're seeing the consequences of erosion of institutions from the Russian perspective and how that's contributed to the instability of a continent, now is the time to strengthen our own institutions and the institutions of our partners, and the Biden-Harris administration is committed to doing just that. Thank you so much for holding this panel today.
Well, thanks so much. So just in closing, first and foremost, I want to thank our panelists. I know I learned a lot. I'm sure everyone else did. There will be a follow-up email with some suggestions, and also, I believe, a link to this if people want to share this panel with others. You can also always go to the forum on the Arms Trade website. And thanks to Jeff and the forum for pulling this together. If you just Google forum on the arms trade, it'll pop right up, and there's all kinds of manner of important resources there that you may want. On April 20th, there'll be the third panel in this kind of serial annual conference. They'll deal with empowering Congress and the executive branch to promote human rights with a good roster of speakers. And I'm sure you'll all get announcements about that as well. So I think that's it. Thanks again. This has been a great panel, and I appreciate everyone's participation.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Bill.
Thanks, Bill.